Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I am really honored to be talking to someone that I've been following for a long time as a fan of the Dan LeBatard Show with Stugotz, and that is Mike Ryan Ruiz, who I think his involvement in the show is really important in understanding the show itself. And so I want to start there. Mike, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. Thank you for your longtime, sometimes vocal support of our show. You've been around for a while.
Thank you.
Uh,
Yeah,
were
you
you an
know,
emailer like way back in the day?
so yes, I believe so. And one of my one of my highlights of okay, we've gotten off track immediately, but I'll brag. One of my highlights is when you played the feud and you were asking for athletes that connoted sex. And I called in with former Arsenal keeper David Seaman. And that was like because I was like, I knew you would like it, and I didn't know if anyone else in the show would really get it, but I was like, that'll play, that'll play. Yeah, so that's a good place to start with the talk is semen jokes. But yeah, so I've been listening probably since 08, 09. Like I was in college around that time, and there wasn't a lot of drive time radio for me. But once I started driving, and once I discovered podcasting, that was really the moment where which I know we'll get into is kind of the origin story for a lot of the fans of the show is the digital access. But so Mike, you are a Miami guy, born and raised Miami, and you didn't start off with this show. This show is 20 years old now. Debut September 1st, 2004. You weren't with the show on the first day as a producer and employee. Where do you come on to the LeBatard Show as a fan?
As a fan, pretty much off the jump. I was curious as someone that loves sports radio and grew tired of 560s style. And anytime a competing station, be it 1700, 940, anytime a competing station would pop up on the scene, I would always gravitate towards it and actually listen to George Sedano's show when George was like close to a teenager, and would listen to Stugotz and Toast on 940. So anything, like I said, anytime there was a competing station, I always gravitated towards it. And 790 was no different in my general appetite for a different option, but it was different in terms of star power. Growing up, born and raised in Miami, as you mentioned, I read Dan's columns regularly. I thought it was a major coup to get Dan LeBatard on the radio. I sampled the show from the beginning, even though the early shows are totally different from what it eventually became, which was more character based and building a community around it. It still, in its earliest incarnation, was, for my money, miles better than what was available to me in the afternoons. Um, just looking at the guest list, you would have guests like Grant Hill join the show, and it wasn't the usual run of the mill guest. So all due respect to Bino Cook and all the great stuff that he did, but that was the level of guests that you would get on 560 and Hank at the time. So it opened up a whole new world of possibilities from just a guest list standpoint. And it was kind of renegade radio. So I gravitated to it pretty much off the jump. I don't have any vivid memories of listening to the very first show. I just know that I got on like pretty early on. And then I would listen to the show from work, and that would kind of coincide with the show kind of finding its footing and playing games like Who Looks Like They Smell Like Cigarettes, stuff like that. And I would get involved with the email community, and I was doing a job that I didn't really like. I was getting paid for the first time because I was my first job out of high school was an internship with the Florida Panthers, and I went like a year and a half without getting a single dime from the Panthers. It was an unpaid internship, but because of the lockout, they had fired so many people that I had a lot of responsibilities. I basically had a real job with a hell of a commute, and I was losing money hand over fist. So I decided, okay, this losing money proposition, it doesn't work out so well. So let me take a job that actually gives me money. And so I was selling pharmaceutical medication for dogs, like veterinary pharmaceuticals, like heartworm prevention, with like dipping a toe in the water and like some of the human stuff, like dermatological stuff. it wasn't a great job. It was sales. It was a lot of swinging and missing. My favorite part of my day was going to my desk and just firing up the web stream and listening to Dan's show. And then I decided, you know what? I have a little nest egg to chase a dream. Let me try this one more time. Because of my experience with the Panthers, I guess it looked good on a resume. And Money Mark Eisenberg called me back after my email inquiring about an internship. And I met with them and I was put on the Kevin Rogers show, which was the show following Dan. I was and the Dolphin Hour as well. So I was screening calls for the Dolphin Hour and the Kevin Rogers show. It allowed me to meet Hawk, the executive producer at the time, in person, introduce myself as an emailer he had come to know. And then shortly thereafter, I was put on the LeBatard Show as an intern, and the rest is history.
So you mentioned a name there that I want to get into in kind of the early stages of the show. If I'm correct me if I'm wrong, the first executive producer is Andy King.
Andy King was the very first executive producer. The show was a good show, but it didn't have the real kitschy, sticky elements that the show is now known for until Hawk came aboard and Andy slid over to just a regular producer on the show that would answer to Hawk. Andy was kind of, I was like his direct report, and he taught me a lot, taught me how to cut sound, very early stages, podcasting. That many people don't know this, but the RSS feed that we have today is the RSS feed that interns on the Dan LeBatard Show created way back when. So cutting sound, logging, learning how to be a producer in those respects, Andy taught me, but I learned at the knee of Mark Hochman too, in terms of getting the show, getting humor, adding sound bites and sound clips and these little drops that were really sticky, learning how to engage an audience with that stuff. I learned that from Hawk, who joined the show not long after its inception. And after he joined, that's when the show got sticky, at least for me.
Yeah.
And the audience. Yeah.
Yeah, I came aboard during the Mark Hochman kind of period. And what I think is interesting in looking at the larger context of Miami radio history, you had mentioned Hank Goldberg at 560, and 560 was the, 800-pound gorilla of sports radio and really kind of pioneered sports radio and talk radio in South Florida. But 790 and the LeBatard Show really signals this change. And I think what I find interesting about Hochman is I see so much of another big Miami radio guy, Phil Hendry, kind of that radio experience. And I think that legacy and Hochman's familiarity with kind of the offbeat radio of the late 80s, early 90s in Miami that wasn't sports, I think is so important. Do you see some of that connection there?
Hawk was absolutely inspired by Phil Hendry. I listened to Phil Hendry when he had a couple of different eras in South Florida where he was cleared and then off the air.
Yeah.
In fact, when Hawk became program director, one of his first moves was to put Phil Hendry on like the overnight schedule because, Hawk and Dan went to college together, used to love that Phil Hendry show. And our show is heavily inspired by Phil Hendry because Hawk was heavily inspired by Phil Hendry. So yeah, that's to seize on that comparison is very cute of you because it wasn't really something that we hid. I think we talked about it openly on the show, our admiration for Phil Hendry, who I also think is a total genius. And people steal from Phil Hendry and they don't know that they're stealing from Phil Hendry because they got an idea or augmented an idea from someone that was absolutely directly inspired by Phil Hendry. And I still don't think to this day Phil gets the credit that he deserves in terms of being a total game changer and being an inspiration to so many. I think a large part of that is people are inspired by him and don't even know it.
Yeah, that's for folks that don't know, seek out like Phil Hendry and his archives, as a guy that's really started in Miami, went national, but like you said, he was, especially when he went national, it was very piecemeal where he would be and not be. He didn't really have a set home per se, but just in terms of understanding where radio could go, not where it was, but where it could go. and
Yeah.
audio in particular is really great. And like you
Audio,
said,
audio remains my favorite medium, I think in part because of the theater of the mind, and nobody explored theater of the mind and playing with that construct because the veil is part of the construct, you
yeah.
know, like you have you can mess with people because the visuals detached from the equation. Yeah, Phil is just an outright genius.
So when Mark Hawkman comes aboard and you're serving on the staff and the crew starts to piece together, kind of the original crew is like you, Hawk, Roy Bellamy, Dan and Stugotz, John Wiener.
Yeah,
Um,
I would also lump Andy King into that
yes, yeah.
original
I'm
crew.
I'm kind of thinking of like who's kind of yeah, exactly. Yeah. Apologies for leaving out Andy. That group, when did you get a sense that you use the word stickiness, the stickiness of the show? When did you get a sense of how sticky this show was once you were on board? Was there a moment, kind of like an eye-opening moment, like, wow, this is something that I didn't anticipate, or I'm seeing something different here that I wouldn't have expected with Hank Goldberg at 560?
You know, it's difficult to say. I know the day that we first beat Hank in the ratings, which always seemed like such a monumental task because as I outlined before, so many challengers had come and gone and didn't register. And back then, the diary system, which wasn't providing true accurate data, it wasn't a coincidence that the change from the diary system to a more accurate beeper system by Arbitron essentially killed Neil Rogers' career
Yeah.
because WQAM had so many legacy listeners and they would write down in their books that they'd listen for 5 hours when the reality of the situation is they'd listen for 4 minutes. So it was a really impressive thing to beat Hank Goldberg head to head in the diary system because I was such a strong legacy brand. But I think, and this has always been a guiding light for me as a producer, Dan, Stu, myself, Hawk in particular, we have a really high standard. I know that that's funny hearing about Stugotz, but in terms of like, especially in his heyday, in terms of like knowing what is funny to us, what is entertaining to us, and if it meets that threshold, the audience is going to like it because in addition to being supremely talented hosts that Dan and Stu are, I think their strongest attributes, and particularly Dan here, is I think Dan's really one of the greatest radio producers ever because no one would drive creative and push to get more out of producers than Dan, and no one knew what the audience wanted better than Dan. And Hawk was a good conduit and a vessel and someone that could pour gasoline on a spark. But Dan really, to this day, and that's not to say he's not keenly aware of what segments of the audience don't want. With as our show fluctuates and the times fluctuate, and our show is viewed as more political, it's not like Dan doesn't know that there are portions of the audience that our show might be turning off by veering into those lanes. It's that Dan has a greater calling with that stuff. He
Yeah.
doesn't really care so much about the blowback. He cares about doing important work. But I think no one is in the history of South Florida radio known exactly what the audience wants better than the audience, quite like Dan LeBatard.
I want to talk about something you mentioned there too, and we'll get into Dan in a second. But the idea of Stugotz, of John Wiener as like radio guy, he is. You mentioned the show is character driven, and he plays a character. And I know there's often a lot of talk at how much that character is real and how much of it is a character. But just going back to that late 2000s, early 2010s period, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he was the program manager of 790 during that time, right?
He was the GM
The GM.
he was the GM and he had several hands when it came to like making programming decisions, but he did hire a program director. Allison Turner was
Yes.
the program director that was there when I got my internship at 790. But yeah, he was outside of like the owners, he was a chief executive at 790's on set.
And when
So
you look at the not just the LeBatard Show, the LeBatard Show is obviously the kind of center of gravity there, but having Boog Shambi, Jorge Sedano, the amount of talent that was able to come into 790 and then where you see it now, I think it is really a testament to Stu's eye for radio. And I think that sometimes gets lost in his position on the show. That I mean, especially, I mean, he was on a heater. He was on an absolute heater at that time.
yeah. Yeah, I think when we were at our peak of just great radio, he wasn't the program director anymore. And that was when you had Sid, Sedano, Boog, LeBatard, Kevin Rogers. Like, I think that was a really, really strong local lineup, and you could sack it against anybody at the nation at that time. But Stugotz had Joe Rose at the very beginning of the station. It's a massive achievement to get Dan to do radio. Dan was doing an occasional ESPN thing, but there had been plenty of stations that had come and gone, and no one had struck a deal with Dan LeBatard. Stugotz struck that deal with Dan LeBatard, and he got Boog. I think the original incarnation of the show was supposed to be Boog and Dan, and I think they were too similar. And as an on-air person, especially in the early going, Stugotz was essential to making that show work and more palatable for an audience that was sampling us, because he was the traditional sports guy, and he was speaking for a large part of the audience that would push back on the non-sports aspect of our show that were largely driven by Dan. It's become, I think it's parodied by so many people. It's even parodied by us now, the construct of, you know, a guy that doesn't want to talk sports with a guy that's more sports. Back in the early days, Stugotz was genuinely a hardcore sports fan. And now it's he's kind of like cosplaying that a little bit. And I think our show would probably do better to actually tap back in and re-engage, and so you can have that more true recipe. But yeah, Dan really worked because he had that counterbalance to him, whether Stu was just being himself, which I genuinely think he was at the time. And I do think that Stu did have the right concerns in terms of palatability. He was trying to steer the conversation to sports more purposefully because of the concerns that a more entertainment-driven, personality-driven show would work.
Sure. So I want to talk a little bit about, let's look at time frame 2009 to 13. Okay, that time frame. It's a time frame in which there's a lot of possibility for the show. There's a lot of change going on within the show. And it's the first time that you're really getting, the show is entering into the national conversation, largely because of the big three and the presence of the big three in the Miami Heat. I want you to imagine here for me, how different do you think the show looks like now? And then I want to get into the specifics of that time frame. How different do you think the show looks today if the big three doesn't happen, if LeBron doesn't come to Miami?
I think that we end up still being national. I don't think we end up being national at the time and place that we did in our show's history, because there was a real appetite for Miami Heat based content. So I think it did kind of fast track our national appeal. But we had national offers before LeBron. We had people kicking the tires. It feels like a bygone era, particularly because the industry has gotten away from it. But the industry used to be on syndicated radio. You would toil away, practice and perfect your craft, build an audience locally, and then get called up to the big leagues. We had people sniffing around us prior to LeBron, but it was only until ESPN came knocking that happened after the LeBron thing. I'm not exactly sure if it would have happened then. We did have feelers out from ESPN before LeBron, but I think it really fast tracked, and at least from a budgetary standpoint, it allowed ESPN to greenlight things such as like the Clevelander studio, and really leaning into the Miami aspects of our show, because that Heat story was just so national in scope. So we owe a lot to LeBron. Maybe if we slow play going national a little bit more, it totally alters our timeline. Budgets from like 2014 to 2017 in terms of what they allocate to talents are totally different.
Right.
So I think we really timed everything. Look at when we came up and we had our disagreement with ESPN. That was really the start of people realizing the actual value of these podcasts. And now the spending on that has retracted. Luckily, our timing has all been right. And maybe it wouldn't have been if LeBron didn't take his talents to South Beach when he did.
So the show in that time frame, going national, ESPN presence, television presence, change in executive producer leadership.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
where you step into that role.
Mhm.
When you step into that role, it's a different show than the show you first joined, right? It's the same players and the same vibe, but it is a different place. And how did you kind of process all that? Again, it's having the feeling like this thing is growing, but also changing. And how much of you did you feel you wanted to embrace the change, and how much of you did you want to ground in what you knew and what you came up with, what you were listening as a fan? Like, how do you maintain that balance?
Well, I think what people don't realize, I'm sure when Hawk left, a lot of people had their doubts. I had my own doubts. Those were mighty big shoes to fill. We weren't national yet. We were still local, but we were top dog.
Yeah.
So he was a scrappy underdog that turned his show into number one, and I was just trying to keep the whole thing together. And by that time, Dan had so much trust in Hawk on air, on the microphone, behind the scenes, driving creative, driving the sonic profile of our show, from big voice to all the imaging to it's the way that it's presented to the down to the events that we agreed to do and how to engage our local audience, to what we did during commercial breaks on the web. Hawk was just such a tour de force in that regard that Dan had immense trust with him. This is somebody that knew Hawk in college and was a friend of his. So that was a really difficult position for me to kind of file in, because I'd had my struggles in my producer role for several years, and then I finally got comfortable, and then Hawk decides to leave, and there's a whole new level of discomfort, not just with the position, because there were technical things that I needed to learn, because Hawk was a radio lifer in terms of manipulating the board and coming up with sounds. He was stronger than me, and I had to kind of do things my way, as opposed he was kind of old school. He had a shortcut, instant replays, more hot buttons. I was more digital,
Yeah.
leaning on playing back from the computer and media touch and different, more digital hot buttons. So making sure that we didn't really dip creatively, making sure that we didn't dip from a guest list standpoint, that was all immensely challenging for me. It was really difficult. But after a year and a half, I'd say I finally got into a comfort zone, and Dan finally had trust in me, and the show didn't dip. We didn't, it would have been really bad if if the moment I got there, people decided to just leave our show. But the audience was still there for us. We didn't dip. We just kept ascending and growing as a show. And then the ascension of the podcast gave us this whole digital audience too, which is something we wouldn't be anywhere without now these days. And the second I got comfortable in that role, then national came a knocking. And then my entire career has just been a series of me being really uncomfortable, finally having confidence in that position, and then having a mighty sea change everything for me, and then going back to general discomfort and lacking in confidence. It's been the cycle for me over these 20 years.
You mentioned the podcast, and that was, as I mentioned, that was where I really came onto the show, was not through live radio. I didn't have a long commute at that time, and I really consumed it through the podcast. And so much of the early show, and really even getting into the 2010s, was driven by the live audience participation, the games, dropping of the suey on callers that would say hello. And a lot of that is really not part of the present show, because it is so podcast driven. Looking back over the scope of time now, and looking at the show now, how much of that do you miss folding in, or how much of that do you just see like that was the time for then, and now this is just the audience we have now, and this is the audience we adapt to?
We've had to reinvent ourselves. I'm kind of proud of our legacy in that everybody would take calls. Sports radio was caller driven, and the host would be a traffic director. And now you look at the landscape of national shows and the biggest podcasts out there, no one takes calls. No one anymore. Like, we had developed such a great caller base. And I think what really killed that was people realizing that they could be funny without having to call in and go through a screener and wait on hold. They can just text their humor in. So we pivoted. Like, the text community became the driving force and was so great for creative, and they had so many funny things. We've had to evolve every step of the way. I love the Suey montage. I love the rule of no pleasantries, but we're talking about 20 years. There's plenty of things that we used to do 20 years ago. AOL was, well, Dan still got AOL, but like, people, industries change, technologies change, and it was our job to adapt whether we knew it or not. I do miss those days of calls, but I'm also romanticizing something that's just not there. Like, we had an audience that was so trained to top that. We had screeners, myself included, that had a really high standard. Like, you were only getting on the air if you had a friggin' heater. As I gradually move on with my career and I move up the ladder, there's different standard bearers that are on that line. So, like, the callers, if we just up and decided, hey, let's be a caller driven show again, you can't replicate that magic. People are generally shy. If they can be funny in other ways, by sending a tweet, sending a text, or what have you, leaving an IG comment, they'll do things that way, rather than just call in. But I'm really proud of the audience that we cultivated. And generally, the idea is similar, whether it was callers, texters, emailers way back in the day, or now social media followers. Like, the community around the show has always kind of been the star. It's more of a contentious relationship now, as social media has just generally gotten more contentious, but that level of engagement and weaponizing our audience, that has always been the secret sauce to the show. That's what makes it sticky, is because the show is the main characters outside of, like, the talent on it. The audience is a character. Now it's just more framed negatively because that's just where we are, where general criticisms about the show are kind of lumped in as a catch-all, which isn't necessarily fair to the audience. But I've also learned over the course of the 20 years that people really aren't motivated to leave like, hey, great job. Hey, the show's doing really well right now.
Yeah.
That, like, positive feedback isn't really a thing, especially on social media or Reddit boards. People generally just want to voice their complaints.
Yeah.
So it's outsized and it's not truly representative. And there are times that I'm down in the dumps. Look, no one feels like something's not landing quite like me. So I understand. We're in a weird place right now where most of the complaints are not even veiled really in political arguments. And I do kind of miss where we were 20 years ago. That's not to say that stuff wasn't still there. I think we can basically categorize all this pushback that we're receiving as just growing pains. It's always hard to mark progress. And typically, as I think we're seeing right now, those that held a certain standard fight like hell to keep it. And they eventually lose, and you readjust and you recalibrate expectations and decorum. And I think we're on the precipice of another reset there.
Yeah. So this, I think, at least in my mind, one of the kind of changes, the way in which I think you see this audience engagement and this reaction, is the show's move to a national platform where
Mhm.
you're exposing a much larger audience to the show that is meant to bring people in, but in some ways has its own language, has its own traditions, has its own. One of my favorite videos I have saved on my phone is Chris Whittingham is producing at the time, and this was within the last couple of years, and there were calls for some reason, and Whitty hit him with the suey, and Jessica Smetana is sitting right next to him, and like doesn't really know what's going on because she particularly, I think she hears the Donald Sterling audio in it, and she's like, who was that? And it's you could see the reaction. Going to a national audience, you're bringing this thing that has built its own language, built its own tradition for a while, and you mentioned kind of the reaction to it. I mean, it must have been bumpy. Did you feel it was particularly bumpy, or did you feel you cleared the hurdle pretty quickly?
It was bumpy in that like we were dealing with like on the local level. We run into like I had beefs with program directors and we had our own little battles, but we were big man on campus, you know. There was, especially when our show got to a certain point, like we were kind of the boss. At ESPN, we weren't. There were people that, you know, we had to answer to, and they had a different way of doing things. And I think they they pushed back enough that it gave us a good gauge, like, hey, let's be a little bit more inclusive than exclusive here. Let's make sure that we reset certain things. But the renegade in me, I remember my experience with the Jim Rome show. And I think nobody really weaponized an audience quite like Jim Rome prior to. And I think I took a lot from Jim Rome's show. The way that Hawk learned from Phil Hendry, I learned from Jim Rome on how to weaponize an audience. And I remembered like what always drew me to Jim was the fact that I wasn't getting all the jokes, all the inside jokes, the smack offs, the culture around the show, the drops, because he wouldn't provide context to them every time. And I was rewarded. The more that I listened, the more I would unlock,
Yeah.
and it would help my appreciation for the show grow. It kind of felt like a club I wanted to be a part of. And I didn't have the full pass code, the secret password to get past the doorman. And like I really leaned on what I would like there. And Dan, whether he knew it or not, whether he knew it was Jim Rome derivative or not, had the same kind of spirit. So I think we had healthy discussions, and it was a reminder to not be so exclusive, but at the same time, we weren't going to explain everything because we knew, and it's a rallying cry now. Like if you, Matthew, you're a fan of the show still. Like if you're out and about, you see someone wearing a DLS shirt, or you overhear a reference to our show, 9 times out of 10, a fan will look at another fan and say, "I get the show. I get the show as
Yeah.
a badge of honor. We get the show."
I was going to tell
And
you, like the idea of being outside the club and wanting to get in, you created that with the LeBatard show. So it was just like, what the hell is this? What's going on? But I got to figure it out. And I mean, to me, the club was the kind of cauldron of like, okay, this is everything that happened the last week. Study this because this is going to come up again. Like something from this will be plugged out and added to the Sui montage and whatever. That idea of kind of creating the language, creating the dialogue between the producer and the audience, that was key. And it could be exclusive, it could exclude people, but if you kind of head down powered through that, the payoff was fantastic.
yeah, and the whole idea was that our show would be really self-involved, and that would work, and that keeps legacy listeners love the self-involvement. That's their favorite part of the show, but especially when I do miss the days of people being able to scan the radio, and because people had probably made their mind up about us. We weren't their first choice, but their first choice went on commercial break, so they might as well sample their second choice. Well, the second choice has, you know, Dwayne Wade on. The second choice has Chris Bosch on in this moment. You're gonna listen, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I like sports. I don't usually like their nonsense, but this is a big guess. Let me hear this. All right, cool. Oh, Dan's got a take on Tim Tebow that everyone's talking about. Tim Tebow. let me stick around and hear his perspective on it. It wasn't like we were always gonna get our self-involved rocks off no matter what. But having a right balance, getting people into the tent, as we would call it, and then finding a way to keep them there was the real challenge. I do miss those days of people scanning though, because you were largely unavoidable. Days like we were more visible. There are a lot of people that are sampling Pat McAfee that would never in a million years sample Pat McAfee. And the reason why they sample him is because he has a platform and it's largely unavoidable. So you might as well do it now. If you don't want to give someone a try, I know as someone that still listens and consumes to sports media, 95% of what I consume is exclusively via social media. Like that's how I follow Colin Cowherd. And what I see one of his takes go viral, and I generally know the spirit of the show, and I can follow the day-to-day musings of Colin through social media. I miss the days where you were kind of like forced to give someone a try because that's where you could get your hooks in them. So now it's a totally different landscape, and you really have to maybe cater to your existing audience even more. So it's hard to grow a show these days unless you're dating Taylor Swift. Like it's really hard to find new, younger audience, people that'll be willing to sample you. It's a really unique challenge. I don't envy it.
So you're talking about this kind of new environment that we're in, and really, I think the LeBatard Show really, as you said, kind of sets the market for these things, including going to ESPN and then leaving ESPN and leaving in a very tumultuous time for media, for the country, for everyone. You've now been independent. You've been independent of ESPN with the DraftKings network for 3 years. Am I doing my math right? About 3 years?
We have been independent
3.5.
3.5 or
Yeah.
I don't know. Like, dude, it's so hard for me because like it was over with ESPN well before it was
Yes.
over.
And that's the
So
interesting thing too, is the threads were coming apart and then it came apart. But it that was definitely the last year. You could
you know
tell that.
what you know
Go
what
ahead.
stopped it coming apart when it probably should have was the pandemic. So like the pandemic happened, our exit wheels were certainly in motion, just given my day-to-day interactions at ESPN. The writing was most certainly on the wall, but the pandemic just kind of froze everything in place
Yeah.
and needed the workforce to come back and for suits to to let enough time subside to where they can justify being cold-blooded
Yeah.
to folks. And that took approximately 7-8 months. And then the rest is history.
Your last, this is probably not relevant, but your last ESPN show or your first like piratey show, I think was January 6th, right? Of
No,
21.
no, it was so January 5th was our last show.
Yes.
January 6th was our first pirate show. And then the events of that day unfolded. And then our
After you had
second
posted the show. Yeah.
Yeah, and then our second show, we did 2 full shows that day
Yeah.
because it was kind of a cool way to be like, this is the show that we've always wanted to do. Let's do
Yeah.
2 of them. So yeah, the timing on that was fortuitous. If I could do it over again, though, I would. It was really annoying to go on a holiday break and go through 2 weeks of lining everything up, but still have to come back for one day and do an ESPN show
Yeah.
because in that, and people have no idea the magnitude and the challenges of what that meant for us. We literally had to swap out all of ESPN's equipment, put it in our own, and do that all in the course of like 12 hours. I would have preferred to do that over the course of 2 weeks.
For sure.
So the way that we did it was really, really, can I curse on this?
Yeah, sure.
really fucking stupid. It was really dumb, but it also worked out for us in that it was a really monumental achievement to be on ESPN one day, be totally independent the next day, and deliver the show to the audience in a timely fashion as they recognized it. People have no idea how difficult, how painstaking, how mentally taxing that achievement was to have the turn of events unfold the way that they did. I mean, look, wouldn't say anything that happened on January 6th was good. If we could undo it, I think we all would.
I'll
But
be
to
sure to
have that,
excerpt that audio and share it. It's like Mike Ryan,
yeah,
for sure. Nothing in
January,
January 6th was good.
yeah, very bad. But one of the byproducts of January 6th was our show at a time that we really needed to find a way. We weren't sure if we could keep our audience. To have that as fodder to really show so early on that this is what the show can be now. We can literally be the voice that you've wanted us to be. We are no longer muzzled and we are no longer confined by ESPN's constraints. There was no authentic way to do that without something in the news stream happening the way that it did. So yeah, like the timing of it was curious, but I started going through an entire holiday break, coming back for one day and leaving ourselves essentially 9 hours to rip out equipment, test new equipment, have everything working, the internet, everything changed. Like we got let go. Like my Wi-Fi wouldn't work anymore because it was Disney's Wi-Fi,
Yeah.
installing our own Wi-Fi, like all of it, like to do that in 9 hours was really stupid, really dumb. But it ended up working out because we left ESPN and we found a way to grow our audience, not lose it. In the early going, in a time where we were free agents, in a time that we were trying to show prospective partners that we could take an audience with us, we delivered and we somehow added to our digital audio audience without the power of ESPN behind it.
So we're here today, and I'm going to wrap up with this question. You've been very generous with your time. I got one more question for you because ultimately my show is focused on Miami history, and this show has gone national. It's gotten a national influence, and people from the show kind of that have come on have gained in national prominence. But ultimately, Miami is a character in the show. It is a Miami, to me, it's a Miami show.
Yeah.
How hard has that been to maintain, and how important is it for you and the show at large to maintain that Miami influence?
I don't think it's ever been more challenging than it is right now, because we're faced with all new challenges and growing the show. We still have to, grow. We should, like, maybe not so much in digital audio. In fact, a lot of the places that we're trying to grow take away from a digital audio audience that we wouldn't have been here in this blessed position were not for that digital audio audience. But you start going live on YouTube and you start adding live hours. Our audience really wants the show ASAP. So people that used to download the show and wait for the podcast now have other avenues to do that. And where we were really good in building our digital audio audience, and we could have done more when we were at ESPN to use the power of those letters. Where I really dropped the ball was using the power of ESPN to build out a digital video space for us. The way that we were on the frontier of digital audio, we kind of lagged behind. And other people like Pat McAfee really leaned into, Ariel Hawani really leaned into the YouTube audience, which is massive. And when you stack our numbers up against some of our contemporaries, you try to explain, well, why are their numbers not here? Well, it's because the digital audio numbers are over here. So we're doing things like the Max Hour with our partnership with Max. That kind of changes how local we are at the start of our show because of the time that we have to deliver this hour to our partners. So we try to we're still trying to figure out the balance of where do you stack local. I've always been of the school of thought, just do local hour last. That's hard to do. It's easier said than done in practice. So I'd say now more than any other point in our show's history, it's really hard to lean Miami, but I also think I'm a very harsh critic on that stuff because that's where the passions are. The Miami Heat passions are there. The Florida
Yeah.
Panthers passions are Panthers are making a cup run. The audience is making a cup run with them. So I think I should learn to lighten up a little bit more. The Dolphins with Tua and Tyreek Hill, they were a national talking point. So I think that there are always going to be aspects of Miami that hang over our show because that's when where people's passions lie. And Dan has always been curious to follow people's passions because it usually delivers the best content.
His name is Mike Ryan Ruiz. He is of Meadowlark Media, the Dan LeBatard Show at Stugotz. And what's your official title now? Chief of Making Cool Shit? Is that?
Yeah, I don't know what my what my title is.
I
I'm
like
doing a
that
lot
title
of
though.
yeah. I know I'm doing a lot. I'm doing a lot of creative projects. I'm still involved in creative on our show, just on a more macro level. I'm still a part of our show because the audience, you know, despite how they may vocalize it on message boards, like, you know, that I'm a familiar voice and
Reddit's
I'm
not
a
real
legacy.
life.
Yeah, I'm a legacy part of the show. So like I'm still doing that stuff, working on business development stuff, working on really cool projects under the Meadowlark umbrella that we can't quite announce yet. Some of them tap into our show's history, and this could be a nice little sample for your audience as we prepare to really have a year-long celebration and being nostalgic and navel gaze, as Dan likes to put it. So I think that there's going to be plenty of reason for legacy listeners and maybe just follow us exclusively on social media these days to maybe come back into the fold and embrace the rich history of this show, as well as do new and exciting things to help grow the show and in the digital video space. It's a really exciting time for us as a show because we're not comfortable. We're not nearly as confident as we were in the media spaces that we had kind of mastered. This is a whole new frontier for us. And with that comes vulnerability. With that comes some grief. With that comes interpersonal strife, stress, and all sorts of fun stuff. But at the end of the day, our audience will rock with us even when things are hard. They did so when we had to kind of invent a whole new way to broadcast during a pandemic, something that the industry later followed. Like we were really the first show to ever work with Zoom and onboard guests with Zoom and find creative workarounds. Like I had a Zoom pod that I rigged out of some equipment directly into an IP device that would feed a radio signal. No one had really done that. I was crudely holding up headsets to speakers trying to
Yeah.
get people to chime in because our show was an ensemble. So our show has done a really good job at rolling with the punches. But can we roll with the punches in our 50s? Can we roll with the punches approaching our 40s? That these are all challenges that other shows have had to run into. Howard Stern's had to change with the times, and I am blessed to be a part of the show that is forced to change with times. That's a good sign. That means you've had a successful show.
And I think you have had and will continue to have a successful show and a show that represents Miami. Mike Ryan Ruiz, thank you so much for your time and your insight into really a Miami institution.
That really warms my heart to hear that it's a Miami institution because at the heart of what we do, we are proudly Miami. We have never left. We have fought like hell to stay here, and we will continue to fight like hell to stay here because it's easy to argue that we're a Miami show if we're in Miami. So
That helps. Mike, thank
thank
you
you.
so much.